the 29th of August 1916, Santo Domingo City. To the residents watching from the shore, the USS Memphis looked like an unshakable island of steel. She was a Tennessee-class armored cruiser, a 14,500-ton behemoth of the United States Navy, boasting 4 massive funnels and 10-inch guns. She wasn't just a ship. She was a floating fortress, designed to project American power across the globe. But by 5 p.m. that evening, this invincible giant would be reduced to a broken, twisted monument of scrap metal, resting in just 20 feet of water. How does a top-tier warship, fully manned and anchored in a known harbor, get destroyed in broad daylight without a single shot being fired? It wasn't a submarine or a mine. It was something the veteran sailors of the era called the Ghost of the Caribbean, a freak meteorological event that defied the laws of seamanship. Today, we go inside the 48-hour window of the USS Memphis disaster, looking at the logs, the telegrams, and the harrowing accounts of the men trapped in the boiler rooms as the ocean tried to swallow them whole. This is the story of Mother Nature's ultimate ambush. To understand the tragedy, you have to understand the machine. The USS Memphis, originally christened the USS Tennessee, was a beast of the Big Stick era, measuring 504 feet in length with a 72-foot beam. Her power plant consisted of 16 Babcock and Wilcox boilers, pushing 2 massive triple-expansion engines to a top speed of 22 knots. She was armored with a heavy belt of Krupp cemented steel, and in 1916, she served as the flagship of the cruiser force, Atlantic Fleet, under Rear Admiral Charles F. Her mission in Santo Domingo was gunboat diplomacy, protecting American interests during a period of local political instability. However, these armored cruisers had a fatal flaw when it came to sudden weather. They were notoriously top-heavy. Their massive guns and thick armor plating meant they sat deep in the water, but their center of gravity made them prone to violent, rhythmic rolling if the sea turned against them. On the morning of August 29, the Caribbean was deceptively calm. There was no hurricane warning and no falling barometer. The Memphis sat at a single anchor, 1,300 yards from the rocky bluffs of the city, seemingly secure. At 1 p.m., Captain Edward L. Beach Sr. looked out at the horizon. The sky was clear, but the sea was doing something strange. It started with a vibration that didn't come from the engines, which were cold, with only 2 boilers banked for auxiliary power, but from the hull itself. Suddenly, massive swells began rolling into the harbor. These weren't standard storm waves. They were rollers. Massive, deep-water surges, likely caused by a distant seismic event or a remote hurricane passing far to the north. These waves were huge, widely spaced, and carried a terrifying amount of kinetic energy. By 2 p.m., the Memphis began to pitch violently. Beach, a veteran who knew the Santo Domingo harbor offered no protection from the south, immediately ordered the ship to prepare for sea. He needed steam, and he needed it now. To move a 14,000-ton ship, you need to boil thousands of gallons of water into high-pressure steam, a process that in 1916 took hours of backbreaking labor to bring more boilers online. Around 3:30 p.m., the situation escalated from concerning to deadly. The swells were now so large that they were breaking over the bluffs of the city, 70 feet high. The Memphis was being lifted like a toy. One moment her bow was pointed at the sky, and the next she was crashing into the trough, her keel nearly striking the harbor floor. Inside the ship, it was chaos as unsecured furniture and equipment became projectiles. But the real nightmare was happening 40 feet below the waterline. The Snipes, the engineering crew, were working in a literal pressure cooker. As the ship rolled up to 40 degrees, the men in the boiler rooms had to brace themselves against scorching steel bulkheads just to stay upright while frantically shoveling coal into the furnaces. Then, the ocean played its cruelest trick. As the ship pitched, the water in the boilers began to surge, causing priming, where liquid water enters the steam lines, a phenomenon that could shatter engine cylinders instantly. At 3:45 p.m., a gargantuan wave, estimated at 70 feet tall, was spotted on the horizon. On the bridge, Admiral Pond and Captain Beach watched in horror as a wall of water engulfed the entire ship. Water poured down the 4 massive funnels, sending tons of seawater cascading into white-hot furnaces. The result was an instantaneous explosion of steam and ash that filled the boiler rooms with scalding vapor. Men were blinded, burned, and suffocated in seconds. Yet many stayed at their posts in an act of incredible heroism, trying to bleed off pressure so the ship wouldn't explode from the inside. The Memphis was now powerless, a steel mountain caught in a maelstrom, drifting toward the jagged rocks of the shoreline. As the ship lost all power, the situation turned from a desperate race for steam into a fight for survival against a coastline that was fast becoming a graveyard. The Memphis was no longer a vessel. She was a 14,000-ton projectile being hurled toward the jagged coral cliffs of Santo Domingo. Captain Beach and his officers stood on the bridge, helpless, as the anchor began to drag across the harbor floor, unable to bite into the seabed against the sheer momentum of the swells. Below decks, the scene was one of pure carnage. The engineering spaces were filled with a thick, blinding fog of superheated steam. Men with skin peeling from their arms and faces stumbled through the darkness, guided only by the screams of their shipmates and the terrifying sound of the ship's hull plates groaning under the pressure. Despite the agony, Chief Machinist's Mate George William Rudd and Machinist's Mate First Class Charles H. Willie refused to abandon their posts. They knew that if the remaining boilers exploded, the ship would be ripped apart from the keel up, killing everyone on board. Their courage in those suffocating moments would later earn them the Medal of Honor, though for Rudd, the cost would be his life. By 4:30 p.m., the Memphis struck the bottom for the first time. The impact was so violent that it felt as though the ship had been hit by a torpedo. She didn't just hit once. The massive swells lifted the entire cruiser and slammed her down repeatedly onto the coral reef. Each impact breached the double bottom, sending seawater rushing into the lower compartments. On the deck, the crew clung to lifelines and railings as waves swept across the ship, carrying away anything not bolted down. A motor launch returning from shore with 20 men was caught in the surf. Despite the frantic efforts of the crew on deck to throw lines, the small boat was capsized by a massive roller, and most of those men were lost to the churning sea. The proximity to the shore was both a curse and a blessing. While the rocks were destroying the ship, they were also the only hope for the nearly 900 men on board. As the Memphis was pushed closer to the bluffs, the city's residents gathered at the top of the cliffs, watching in stunned silence as the pride of the American fleet was dismantled by the waves. The ship finally came to rest hard against the rocks, listing heavily to starboard. With the engines dead and the ship flooded, Captain Beach realized the only way to save his men was to establish a lifeline to the shore. Braving the green seas that continued to bury the deck, the crew managed to fire a line-throwing gun toward the cliffs. The people of Santo Domingo, despite the political tensions of the time, rushed forward to grab the lines. They secured them to trees and rocks atop the bluff, creating a primitive breeches buoy system. One by one, and then in groups, the exhausted, burned, and battered sailors were hauled through the air, dangling over the crashing surf, until they reached the safety of the heights. The rescue lasted through the night and into the following morning. The darkness was illuminated only by the flashes of lightning from the storm and the searchlights of the USS Christened, which had miraculously managed to claw its way out to sea before the worst of the swells arrived. On the Memphis, the officers remained until the very end, ensuring every living man was accounted for. When Captain Beach finally stepped off his ship, he looked back at a ruin. The Memphis sat upright but dead, her hull buckled, her magnificent funnels bent, and her interior a labyrinth of twisted metal and ash. 43 men had perished in the disaster, most of them in the hellish heat of the boiler rooms or lost in the initial surge of the waves. In the 48 hours that followed, the shock of the loss rippled through the Navy Department in Washington, D.C. A court of inquiry was immediately convened to determine how such a powerful ship could be lost in a matter of hours. The findings were a mix of professional tragedy and meteorological mystery. While Captain Beach was technically held responsible for not having sufficient steam pressure to move the ship earlier, the naval community largely viewed the event as an act of God. The rollers that hit Santo Domingo were later analyzed as a rare combination of a distant hurricane's swell and a localized seismic surge, a salamion, perfect storm of physics that no ship of that era could have fought. The USS Memphis was never salvaged. The cost to refloat the mangled hull was deemed too high. She remained on the rocks for decades, a rusting skeleton that served as a grim reminder to every sailor who entered the harbor. No matter how much steel you wrap around yourself, you are always a guest on the ocean's surface. The technical mystery of why the Memphis was destroyed while other ships nearby survived comes down to a phenomenon known as shallow water wave steepening. as those massive deep ocean rollers entered the relatively shallow waters of Santo Domingo's harbor. Their velocity decreased, but their energy had nowhere to go but up. This transformed rhythmic swells into vertical walls of water that exceeded the physical height of the ship's upper decks. Because the Memphis had a deep draft of nearly 28 feet, she was trapped in the kill zone where the waves began to break. The USS Christened, a much smaller gunboat with a shallower draft, was able to pitch and roll over the crests and claw its way to the safety of the deep sea. The Memphis, weighted down by 1,500 tons of armor plate and her massive 10-inch gun turrets, lacked the buoyancy to rise with the surges. Instead of riding the waves, she became a stationary breakwater, absorbing the full force of millions of tons of moving water. The legacy of the Memphis disaster forced a radical rethink in naval architecture and harbor safety protocols. It highlighted the extreme vulnerability of the big stick cruisers to the environment, leading the Navy to prioritize higher freeboards and better protected ventilation systems in future designs. The disaster also became a case study in boiler room heroism. The Navy realized that in the age of steam, the fate of a ship was decided not just by the captain on the bridge, but by the firemen and machinists working in the dark, heat-choked bowels of the vessel. The 3 Medals of Honor awarded to George William Rudd, Charles H. Willey, and Claude Ashton Jones remain some of the most respected in the annals of the engineering corps. They didn't fall in combat against a human enemy. They fought a desperate, losing battle against physics and high-pressure steam to give their shipmates a few extra minutes to escape. As for the ship herself, the USS Memphis became a literal part of the Santo Domingo coastline. For over 20 years, the wreck sat where the waves had thrown her, a ghost ship visible from the city's Malecon. She became a landmark, a playground for local divers, and a haunting reminder of the day the ocean rose up. It wasn't until 1937 that the ship was finally sold for scrap. A wrecking crew arrived with torches and explosives, slowly dismantling the steel giant that Mother Nature had already broken. Today, very little remains of the Memphis at the site, save for some scattered debris on the seafloor and the stories passed down by the families of those who watched her die. The story of the 48-hour storm is a humbling chapter in military history. It serves as a reminder that even the most advanced technology of its time has a breaking point. The USS Memphis was the pinnacle of industrial age engineering, a symbol of national pride, and a fortress of steel. But in the face of the ghost of the Caribbean, she was nothing more than a leaf in a whirlpool. To the older guys and naval historians who study her today, the Memphis isn't just a shipwreck. She is a testament to the bravery of the American sailor and a permanent warning that the sea remains the ultimate commander. The aftermath of the disaster was not just a matter of cleaning up the shoreline. It was a grueling legal and professional battle that would define the final years of Captain Edward L. Beech's career. The Court of Inquiry was a somber affair, held in a climate of intense scrutiny as the United States edged closer to involvement in World War I. The Navy Department struggled to reconcile how a state-of-the-art flagship could be lost so ignominiously. During the testimony, the technical data regarding the rollers took center stage. Survivors described waves that looked like solid mountains of green glass, moving at speeds that made the ship's anchors feel like they were made of wood. Captain Beech testified with a stoicism that masked the heartbreak of losing his command. He defended his decision to keep the ship in the harbor, citing the lack of any barometric warning. In 1916, the science of meteorology was still in its infancy. The concept of a seiche, or a distant hurricane sending out rogue swells without wind, was almost mystical to the average sailor. The court eventually found that while the weather was unprecedented, Beech was technically guilty of not having his boilers ready for sea at all times in a dangerous port. This verdict was a bitter pill for many in the service to swallow, as the time required to bring a Tennessee-class cruiser to full steam was well documented. Despite the official reprimand, Beech's reputation among his peers remained largely intact. He was a man who stayed on his bridge until the last of his crew was safe, a fact that resonated deeply with the Old Navy traditionalists. In a poetic twist of history, his son, Edward L. Beech Jr., would go on to become one of the most famous submarine commanders of World War II and the author of Run Silent, Run Deep, ensuring the Beech family name remained synonymous with naval excellence and resilience. Today, the artifacts of the USS Memphis are scattered across the United States, serving as silent witnesses to those 48 hours of fury. The ship's bell, which once rang out the watches in the humid Caribbean air, now resides at the National Museum of the U.S. Navy in Washington, D.C. It is a pilgrimage site for naval veterans and the descendants of the Memphis crew. In Santo Domingo, the memory of the American ghost persists in local folklore. For decades after the scrap crews left, pieces of Krupp steel could still be found embedded in the coral, fused to the rock by the sheer force of the grounding. The disaster even impacted international relations. The sight of American sailors and Dominican civilians working together to save lives during the rescue became a rare moment of unity in an otherwise turbulent era of intervention. The legacy of the Memphis also lives on in the Memphis Rule, an unofficial but vital lesson taught to midshipmen at the Naval Academy. It's the principle that a captain must respect the hidden data of the ocean, the currents, the surges, and the swells that don't show up on a barometer. It's a lesson in humility. The Memphis was a ship built for a world where steel was king, yet she was brought down by the simplest and most ancient force on Earth, moving water. As we look back on those 48 hours in 1916, we don't just see a naval tragedy, we see a portrait of human endurance. We see the snipes in the boiler rooms choosing duty over life, the officers maintaining order as the deck tilted toward the abyss, and a captain who bore the weight of his ship's ghost for the rest of his days. The USS Memphis remains a haunting reminder that in the eternal struggle between man-made giants and Mother Nature, the ocean always has the final word. The following technical breakdown and detailed investigation into the final hours of the USS Memphis provides the concluding data-rich analysis for our script. This section focuses on the specific engineering failures, the harrowing Medal of Honor citations, and the long-term forensic analysis of the wreck. The technical reality of what occurred inside the hull of the USS Memphis during those final 48 hours is a case study in thermodynamic catastrophe. To understand why the ship couldn't escape, we have to look at the steam curve. On the morning of August 29, the Memphis was operating on what was known as auxiliary steaming. Only 2 of her 16 Babcock and Wilcox boilers were lit, providing just enough power for lighting, ventilation, and the distilling of fresh water. When Captain Beach realized the swells were becoming dangerous, he ordered the Black Gang, the firemen, and coal passers to light every remaining boiler. In a coal-fired cruiser of 1,916, this was a Herculean task. It involved physically hauling hundreds of tons of coal from the bunkers, breaking it down, and hand-shoveling it into the furnaces. Under normal conditions, it took 4 to 6 hours to bring the Memphis to full steam pressure. On that afternoon, the crew had less than 60 minutes before the ocean turned the harbor into a graveyard. As the swells intensified to heights of 40 and 50 feet, the physics of the ship's movement became the enemy of the machinery. The Memphis began to roll so violently that the water levels inside the boilers became unstable. In a steam boiler, the water must stay level to properly cover the heating tubes. When the ship rolled 40 degrees, the water surged to one side, exposing the white-hot metal tubes to dry heat while the other side was submerged. This created a phenomenon called priming. Instead of pure steam entering the main lines to the engines, a deadly mixture of steam and liquid water was sucked into the pipes. Water is incompressible. If it hits a reciprocating engine's pistons, it acts like a steel rod, shattering the cylinder heads and twisting the massive connecting rods. Below decks, the engineers were fighting a two-front war. They had to keep the fires hot enough to make steam, but they had to throttle the engines back to prevent them from exploding due to the water surge. The bravery displayed in these moments is immortalized in the Medal of Honor citations of 3 men, George William Rudd, Charles H. Willey, and Claude Ashton Jones. Their actions represent the pinnacle of naval engineering sacrifice. Chief Machinist's mate George William Rudd was in the engine room when the first massive wave hit the ship, sending a deluge of water down the funnels. The resulting explosion of steam was so violent that it blew the furnace doors open, vomiting white-hot coals and ash into the workspace. Rudd knew that if the main steam line ruptured, everyone in the compartment would be boiled alive instantly. Despite the agonizing heat and the pitch-black darkness caused by the electrical failure, Rudd stayed at his post, manually operating the valves to bleed off the pressure. He was so severely burned that he would succumb to his injuries days later. But his refusal to abandon the valves prevented a catastrophic boiler explosion that would have snapped the ship in half. Charles H. Willey, a machinist's mate first class, was trapped in a different compartment as the ship began to strike the bottom. The hull was buckling, and seawater was spraying into the electrical switchboards, creating a lethal environment of steam and high-voltage short circuits. Willie climbed over scalding pipes to reach the emergency valves, staying until he was nearly unconscious from the heat. Meanwhile, Claude Ashton Jones, a lieutenant, coordinated the evacuation of the injured men from the lower decks while the ship was being hammered against the rocks. He repeatedly entered areas filled with superheated vapor to drag his shipmates to the ladders. These three men didn't just perform their jobs, they functioned as human circuit breakers, absorbing the trauma of the ship's death so that the rest of the crew had a chance to reach the deck. While the men fought below, the ship itself was undergoing a forensic nightmare. The Memphis was an armored cruiser, which meant she had a protective deck, a layer of steel armor several inches thick that ran horizontally through the ship to protect the vitals from plunging shell fire. This deck, designed to save the ship in battle, became a death trap during the storm. It trapped the rising water and steam below, making the engineering spaces a pressurized oven. Furthermore, the very weight of her Krupp cemented armor, nearly 2,000 tons of it, worked against her. As the waves lifted the ship and slammed her down, the momentum of the armor belt acted like a giant sledgehammer, crushing the ship's own structural ribs. Every time the Memphis hit the coral, she wasn't just taking external damage. The internal weight was literally pancaking the lower decks. The meteorological data, gathered in the years after 1916, suggests that the Memphis was the victim of a meteote tsunami. While a traditional tsunami is caused by an earthquake, a meteote tsunami is triggered by rapid changes in atmospheric pressure, often associated with fast-moving squall lines or distant hurricanes. In the case of the Memphis, the storm was invisible because the wind and rain were hundreds of miles away, but the energy of the storm had been transferred into the deep ocean. These waves traveled across the Caribbean at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. When they hit the shelving bottom of the Santo Domingo harbor, their height tripled. This explains why the barometer on the Memphis didn't drop. The storm wasn't in the air, it was in the water. In the final accounting of the disaster, 43 men were lost. The majority of these casualties occurred in two places: the steam-choked boiler rooms and the motor launch that was caught in the surf. For the survivors, the psychological toll was immense. They had watched a 500-foot fortress be torn apart by nothing more than water. Captain Beech's later life was a reflection of this weight. Though he continued to serve and was a prolific writer, he was haunted by the technicality that he hadn't prepared for sea fast enough. Yet, modern naval simulations have shown that even if Beech had started his engines 20 minutes earlier, the sheer height of the breakers would likely have swamped the ship as she tried to exit the harbor, potentially leading to an even greater loss of life in deeper water. The wreck of the Memphis remained a dominant feature of the Santo Domingo skyline for 2 decades. It became a symbol of the old Navy passing away. By the time she was scrapped in 1937, the era of the armored cruiser was over, replaced by the fast battleship and the aircraft carrier. But the lessons of the Memphis remained. She taught the Navy about the shallow water effect, the dangers of top-heavy designs, and the absolute necessity of rapid start propulsion systems, lessons that would eventually lead to the development of oil-fired boilers and gas turbines. For the veterans who watch the horizon today, the story of the USS Memphis is a reminder of the silent enemy. We often focus on the battles of Midway or Leyte Gulf, where steel met steel. But the Memphis reminds us of the raw, elemental power that exists regardless of politics or war. She was a giant of her age, a masterpiece of American industry, and she was undone in 48 hours by the very element she was built to conquer. The names of Rood, Willie, and Jones are etched in the halls of the Navy, not just for their bravery, but for their commitment to the machine and their brothers in arms. As the sun sets over the Caribbean today, the ghost of the Memphis still speaks to those who listen, a warning that on the ocean, there is no such thing as unsinkable.